Assignment 2 Part 1 Working in Community Services. Research a target group or social issue allocated in class and identify social indicators of disadvantage and marginalization. B. Discuss causes of disadvantage and marginalization and the impact of social institutions. C. Present your findings in an online presentation. This presentation is to discuss the social indicators of marginalization and disadvantages of male victims of domestic violence and the impacts of social institutions. Let's start with the question: what is domestic violence? Domestic violence refers to violence, abuse, and intimidation between people who are currently or have previously been in an intimate relationship. Men are statistically as likely to fall victim to domestic violence as women are. Facts and figures. In the last 12 months, over 1 in 3 persons who experienced violence from an intimate partner were male, 35.3%. Almost 1 in 3 persons who experienced violence from a cohabiting partner were male, 32.7%. Almost 2 in 5 persons who experienced violence from a current partner were male, 39.9%. Over 1 in 3 persons who experienced violence from a boyfriend or girlfriend, or date were male, 34.3%. Almost 1 in 5 persons who experienced violence from a previous partner were male, 18.8%. Almost half the persons who experienced violence from a known person were male, 45.5%. Almost half the persons who experienced emotional abuse by a partner were male, 45.8%. 47.7% of persons who experienced it by a current partner and 43.4% by a previous partner. Almost half of these males experienced anxiety or fear due to the emotional abuse, 41.4% of males who experienced current partner abuse and 43.1% of males who experienced previous partner abuse. 13.8% of men that experienced emotional abuse by a current partner had their partner deprive them of basic needs such as food, shelter, sleep, or assistive aids, compared to 6.4% of women. 8.9% of men that experienced emotional abuse by a current partner had their partner threaten to take their child/run away from them, compared to 4.6% of women. 38.5% of men that experienced emotional abuse by a previous partner had their partner lie to their child with the intent of turning them against them, compared to 25.1% of women. 7.3% of men that experienced emotional abuse by a current partner had their partner lie to other family members or friends with the intent of turning them against them, compared to 6.6% of women. 10.1% of men that experienced current partner emotional abuse had their current partner keep track of where they were and who they were with, compared to 9.9% of women. Over 1 in 3 persons who experienced sexual harassment were male, 34%. Most males who experienced sexual harassment were harassed by a female perpetrator, 72.2% were harassed by a female while 48.2% were harassed by a male. The largest category of increase in sexual harassment between 2012 and 2016 was in males harassed by a female perpetrator, which rose by a massive 67.5%. Females harassed by a male perpetrator rose by 15% during the same period. Over 1 in 3 persons who experienced stalking were male, 35%. Most males who experienced stalking were stalked by a male perpetrator, 68.9% were stalked by a male while 36.3% were stalked by a female. Almost 1 in 3 persons who experienced sexual assault were male, 28.4%. Most males who experienced sexual violence were assaulted or threatened by a female perpetrator, 82.9%. 6% of all males experienced violence compared to 4.7% of all females. The majority of men that experienced intimate partner violence experienced it by a female perpetrator, 93.6%. The remainder were in same-sex relationships with male perpetrators. Since the age of 15, men were 2 to 3 times more likely than women to have never told anybody about experiencing partner violence, around 50% more likely than women to have never sought advice or support about experiencing partner violence, almost 20% more likely than women to have not contacted police about experiencing partner violence, and less than half as likely as women to have had a restraining order issued against the perpetrator of previous partner violence. Why are male victims of domestic violence considered to be disadvantaged and marginalized, and what are the impacts of social institutions? Male victims of family violence and abuse, like women, often face many barriers to disclosing their abuse. They are likely to be told that there must be something they did to provoke the perpetrator's abuse. They can suffer shame, embarrassment, and the social stigma of not being able to protect themselves. They can fear that if they disclose the abuse there will be nowhere for them and their children to escape to. In cases of intimate partner violence, they can fear that if they disclose the abuse or end the relationship, their partner might become more abusive and or take the children. They can feel uncertain about where to seek help, or how to seek help. Services are less likely to ask whether a man is a victim of family violence, and when they do ask, they are less likely to believe him. Indeed, many health departments have mandatory domestic violence screening for young women, but no such screening for young men. Male victims can be falsely arrested and removed from their homes because of the assumption that because they are male, they must be a perpetrator and not a victim. When this happens, children can be left unprotected from the perpetrator of the violence, leading many men to suffer the abuse in silence in an attempt to protect their children. Because of these barriers, men are much less likely to report being a victim of family violence than are women, and women also frequently don't report violence against them. It is more often portrayed in the media that men are the perpetrators and not the victims. This is often heavily campaigned and has led to a lot of social stigma that is followed across a lot of social institutions including government. A lot of media campaigns are government funded, and funding is more heavily aimed towards female victim services. It is impressed upon children in schools and taught by parents. This often leads to services, police, domestic violence services, courts, and family and friends being gender biased when a male victim come forward to report the crime. Men are seen in society as being the strong provider, the breadwinner, the boss. A good example of social acceptance of male domestic abuse would be if a male stated his girlfriend, wife, or partner stated, "I don't like your friends, you cannot go out," and enforce this with emotional or physical force. The man would be called a soft or told they are whipped under the thumb, etc. To reverse that situation, the male would be called controlling. Because of society's edict, a man who would consider coming forward as a victim may fear being ridiculed or not believed. They may fear losing their children, home, loved ones over it. But there is an emerging trend of more support being gathered for these victims. A good example of this in Australian society would be the case of Catherine Knight and her victim John Price. Catherine had a known history of previous violence and manipulation towards her ex-partner. When she first attacked John Price, he approached family, friends and the authorities with his concerns and was brushed off as disbelief or overreaction. If his claims had have been taken seriously, it may have been preventable. In conclusion, if we were to put forward more support and services to male victims and include more information when sharing knowledge about both male and female victims, there would, in my opinion, be less social stigma on the topic. Thank you.